Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Heaven Can Wait, Ritual and Religion in Confucianism. Here's what to do when someone dies. Wash and put up their hair. Cut their nails. Put plugs in the ears and rice in the mouth, and then cover it with dry shells. Label a coffin with the name of the deceased and decorate it with shrouds, like curtains. More and more ornamentation should be added as the person lies in state. This is a way to move the corpse gradually away from the living and to ward off any feelings of disgust. If the person who died is the king, there should be no fewer than 7 layers to the coffin. A lord gets 5, a minister 3. Next, call the mourners to the funeral. All the lords for a dead king, all the ministers for a lord, and so on. If the person died by execution for a crime, only his wife and children may attend. Grave goods will be offered at the burial, but not made fully ready. For instance, a lute will remain untuned, and reed baskets will still have gaps. This is to indicate that these things will not be used. After the funeral, there begins a mourning period of 3 years. Why 3 years? Well, this is the means by which one sets a limit for the utmost hurt, a proper measure for it, such that once mourning is made sufficient to achieve good form and proper order, then one stops it. During the 3 years, you will wear mourning garments, lean on a cane, live in a shack, eat gruel, and sleep on a rough mat. These are the forms used by the gentleman when he is moved by what he finds sorrowful and hurtful. Even after the 3 years are up, you should still sacrifice to your ancestors, serving the dead as if one were serving the living. We take these instructions from the 19th chapter of the Sun Tzu, which is dedicated to one of his favorite subjects, ritual. His prescriptions sound pretty demanding. You can see why Confucius' student, Zai Wu, wanted to stop mourning after just 1 year. And that's only the beginning, because the funeral rites were only one of many rituals that needed to be observed by a good Confucian. Especially at a royal court, the calendar of ritualistic events would have been full to bursting. Sacrifices to bring rain, war dances by ranks of soldiers wielding jade spears and shields made of cinnabar, drinking parties with the participants carefully seated by age, an ascent of Mount Tai, with valuable goods buried at the peak and foot of the mountain to honor heaven and earth. This last ritual was to be carried out only by the king, the son of heaven, which is why Confucius was so annoyed when mere lords started doing it. It seems then that these Confucians were a pretty religious bunch. Or perhaps not. In his detailed description of the funeral rites, Sun Tzu says essentially nothing that we could associate with religious beliefs. Nothing about souls or spirits of those who have died, or where they may have gone. Nothing about a god or gods they may have joined. Nothing about sacred revelations or insights that these rituals may give us into the universe or our place in it. One gets the impression that for Sun Tzu, the ritual is not really performed for religious reasons at all. Rather, we do it because it is traditional, and because it expresses our relationship to those who have passed away. As he puts it, we serve the dead as if they were alive, serve the absent as if they were present, and the end and beginning are unified. Certainly, Sun Tzu did not think that we perform rituals expecting guaranteed results. He says in one striking passage, "One performs the rain sacrifice and it rains. Why? I say, there is no special reason why. It is the same as when one does not perform the rain sacrifice and it rains anyway." This reveals a dramatic shift from earlier attitudes. Oracle bones preserved from the Shang period reveal a more transactional attitude towards the spirit realm. A divination might, for example, instruct that a field be left alone for the use of the gods, in exchange for abundant yield in other fields. On the basis of such evidence, Michael Puett has suggested that people in the Shang period saw themselves as being in a kind of negotiated competition for natural resources with the gods. Ancestral spirits likewise needed to be placated. If they were unsatisfied, they might send illnesses or other calamities. Standing over them all was the chief god Di, or Shan Di, who controlled wind and rain. This conception of the most authoritative divine agent associated with the sky, or heaven, Tian, survived into the Zhou period, as we can see from the standard designations of the king as the son of heaven, and as ruling over all who live under heaven. The Zhou invoked him as part of their political ideology, claiming that they had been right to depose the Shang because this earlier dynasty had lost heaven's mandate, Tianming. An inscription from the Zhou period proclaims that, "Then august heaven tirely watched over and protected us, the rulers of the Zhou, and greatly strengthened the mandate." The Zhou king was seen as a kind of representative or executor of divine rule, able to direct whatever is sent by heaven and the spirits. Along similar lines, the Zhou Zhuang, a historical commentary we discussed in episode 4, says that heaven gave birth to the people and set up rulers to superintend and shepherd them, and see to it that they do not lose their true nature as human beings. Humans were seen as having a tripartite relationship with heaven and earth, with the ruler taking a lead role among humans to harmonize the partnership with heaven and earth. This triadic scheme is still present in Confucian texts like the Zhongyong and the Xunzi. Confucians regarded heaven with great reverence, treating it as the very ground of morality. They also adopted the language of heaven's mandate, which for them underpinned political legitimacy. But other entities we might consider religious in character, namely ancestral spirits and ghosts, play a much less central role. The Analects advises us to respect the ghosts and spirits while keeping them at a distance, and says, when sacrificing to the spirits, you should comport yourself as if the spirits were present. This remark is finely calibrated, certainly not skeptical or atheistic, but also rather non-committal. The correct frame of mind would be like that of the child who isn't quite sure whether Santa Claus is in fact watching, but determines to be good for goodness sake throughout the month of December, just in case. Huot sums up the Confucian attitude towards the spirits in less seasonal terms as follows. Humans should not speak of them, should avoid worrying about them, and should perform ritual actions not to influence them, but to cultivate themselves. And yet one must still revere them. Indeed, the highest way to revere them is precisely not to try to influence them. That Confucians did indeed continue to adopt a reverential attitude and to take ritual practices seriously hardly needs further emphasis. These were, of course, core philosophical commitments of the movement, and also something like a professional credo. According to Robert Eno's book, The Confucian Creation of Heaven, Confucianism, or Ruism, was not primarily a political movement, but first and foremost groups of men meeting to practice and discuss ritual ceremonies and music, immediately motivated by the ideal expectation of attaining transcendent wisdom and the practical expectation of employment as a ritual master. Eno imagines how these scholars must have seemed to their contemporaries, a group of eccentrically costumed disciples assembled at their master's house, carefully stepping through an intricately scripted and choreographed ritual under the eye of their teacher, a band of men mastering an endless variety of ancient dances. But of course, the Confucians took ritual and music with utmost seriousness. We've often spoken of how Kongzi and the other Confucians looked back to the sages and kings of the past for paradigms of good behavior and good rule. It was for this reason that they wore archaic clothing and used antiquated language. If this made them seem ridiculous to critics like Mozi, it was also the very foundation of a profound ethical teaching. And at a more pragmatic level, it could make the Confucians employable. A ruler of the warring state's time who was convinced that political success lay in renewing the rituals of the past would have to turn to the Ru scholars to advise him on the elaborate etiquette of the complicated ceremonies in which they were so expert. In fact, Eno argues that it was most often as ceremonial experts that the Ru were able to find positions at court rather than as ministers exerting influence on government policy. This helps us to understand why the Confucians insisted on careful observation of the rituals, even in the absence of what we might call a properly religious explanation of every little detail. In fact, Kongzi admits in the Analects that he cannot explain an ancestral sacrifice. Far from thinking that it would therefore make sense to abandon it, he adds that someone who did understand it could handle the world as if it sat in the palm of his hand. Cheng-Ying Cheng has thus suggested that the Confucians were committed to divinity without theology. We find a further development of this position with Xunzi's attitude towards ritual, which we have ourselves described back in episode 15 as detached reverence. As we can see from his remark about the rain sacrifice, Xunzi encourages his readers simply to carry out rituals without expecting anything in return. This would be to blur the boundary between human and heaven, falsely suggesting that we can manipulate what is beyond our earthly sphere. He also discourages his readers from concerning themselves with omens or the supernatural. Instead, we should focus on what we can control, namely ourselves. A whole chapter of the Xunzi is devoted to heaven, which is presented as an impersonal and implacable force. Xunzi says, that which is accomplished without anyone's doing it, and which is obtained without anyone seeking it, is called the work of heaven. One lesson he draws is this: you must not complain against heaven, its way is simply thus. This may sound unnerving, but is in fact meant to give us confidence. Anyone who follows the Tao will be able to withstand whatever heaven may throw at them. Thus, the ruler is instructed to let his ministers worry about heaven and focus himself entirely on the Tao. In practice, this means, above all, ensuring that rituals are carried out properly. Whereas a person's fate rests with heaven, the fate of the state rests with ritual. It is in this spirit, and not one of anti-religious critique, that Xunzi offers what is sometimes called a naturalistic account of ritual. Another chapter of the Xunzi is devoted to this topic. It begins by explaining that, given the badness of human nature, the sage kings instituted various rituals as a way of preventing the chaos that would arise from conflicting and frustrated human desires. Ritual, Xunzi says, establishes a lofty standard that is ultimate of its kind, and none under heaven can add to or subtract from it. It's no coincidence that the very next chapter concerns itself with music. We don't usually think of music primarily in connection with ritual. Yes, music gets played at churches, but also at Metallica concerts. But like Metallica, Xunzi had a carefully articulated account of for whom the bell tolls. And not only bells, also flutes, zithers, and drums. All these instruments are used to bring uniformity to all under heaven. His treatment of music is, in a way, the complement of what he says about ritual. Just as ritual is intended to keep unruly human desires under control, so music is intended to channel human joy. The rituals already mentioned would frequently, if not always, have involved music, and for Xunzi it is entirely natural to move straight from a discussion of music into a description of a village drinking ceremony. The seating order, the conduct of the host, and the playing of music during the ceremony all make it possible to enjoy oneself while carefully abiding by rules laid down through long tradition. His illustration is a good one, since a gathering for the sake of drinking wine is an event that could all too easily become disorderly. That disorder is prevented by the ritual customs. If this is possible, then surely it is possible at a grander scale for a wise ruler to use ritual and music to keep his population in line. This is presumably why Xunzi concludes the section with the words, "When the state is settled, then all under heaven will become settled. Hence I say, when I observe the village drinking ceremony, I know how easy and carefree the way of a true king is." To some extent, Xunzi's claims about music seem like common sense. When he says that it affects the listener quickly, yet deeply, we can readily agree, thinking perhaps of long-haired dancers thrashing in the mosh pit at a Metallica concert, or people sitting with refined decorum at a Mozart concert. But as we learned from Erica Brindley in a recent episode, the Confucians think that music can do much more than this. The harmonies woven into traditional music by the sages who originally invented it were thought to echo the harmonious structure of the cosmos as a whole. Thus, a text like the aforementioned Zhongyong can speak of the attainment of harmony, he, as the Tao. Its interpretation of the idea that virtue lies in the mean, which reminds one so forcefully of Aristotle, is actually rather un-Aristotelian. The mean or middle state is more like a condition of equilibrium or balance, shang. When strong emotions surge within us, we are taken out of this state, but by following the Tao and pursuing education, we are able to return to a balanced condition. We might say that emotions put us into a discordant state, and that training in virtue and ritual allow us to get back in tune. The claim that nature itself is harmonious brings us back to the question of heaven, given that the word tian is sometimes translated as heaven and sometimes as nature. The Confucians do seem to have been deeply convinced that the world is well ordered, not unlike the state under the governance of a sage king. But cosmological harmony doesn't mean that things will always go as we would like them to. Kongzi lamented upon the death of his friend Yan Hui, "Heaven is against me." On the other hand, he also said it was heaven that provided him with virtue, and that he was not bitter towards heaven because no one understood his teaching properly, adding, If there is anyone who could understand me, perhaps it is heaven. So, the Analects presents us with a rather mixed, even confusing set of ideas about this topic. This left room for the development of different ideas about heaven in later Confucians. Whereas the Xunzi simply tells us not to worry about heaven, the Mengzi suggests that we should make an active effort to align ourselves with it. Thus it states, "Those who are obedient to heaven are preserved, those who go against heaven are annihilated." Heaven is also blamed or credited with preventing Mengzi himself from offering advice to a certain ruler. For Mengzi, heaven's decree seems to be close to or even identical with fate. Its workings remain obscure to us, so that we can know it only through its actions. Given this fact, all we can do is strive to do good and trust heaven to send success or not. This is fairly close to Xunzi's idea that heaven is just a word for everything that happens that is outside of human control. Yet Mengzi also appeals to heaven as the very source of morality. These ideas are not inconsistent and, in a sense, even come to the same thing. Just as we should not question heaven's authority in the moral realm, so we should not protest or even expect to understand when heaven sends events that seem regrettable to us. It is for us to align with heaven, not the other way around. Thus Mengzi writes that heaven, when it is about to place a great burden on a man, always first tests his resolution, exhausts his frame, and makes him suffer starvation and hardship, frustrates his efforts so as to shake him from his mental lassitude, toughen his nature, and make good his deficiencies. And he agrees with the point Xunzi will later make, that it belongs to wisdom to use well whatever heaven sends our way. He says that we should accept whatever is correct in fate. A study of the problem of evil in Chinese philosophy by one of our podcast guests, Fragment Perkins, thus sees Mengzi and Xunzi as basically singing from the same hymn sheet on this topic. He comments that for Mengzi, heaven simply represents those forces or events in the world that are inexplicable and irresistible, and that likewise fate is just a name for whatever cannot be controlled within the limits of the way. Similarly, Xunzi sees that which comes from heaven as a kind of raw material that can be used well or badly. While it may seem from a human point of view that natural calamities are, well, calamitous, in fact they are just a chance for us to show our virtue and prove our mettle, especially if we happen to be the ruler or his leading advisors. In fact, it is heaven who puts people in that position in the first place. In a debate recorded in the Mengzi, our eponymous philosopher discusses with an interlocutor named Wan Zhan whether the sage king Yao bequeathed his rule to the sage king Shun. Mengzi denies this. Rather, it was heaven that gave the empire to Shun. It was heaven that allowed Shun and Yao to live long enough together that Shun could assist his illustrious colleague for 28 years. No human can force heaven to bestow such opportunities. And yet, one can defy heaven, as Shun would have done if he had usurped power upon Yao's death. Again, the goal must be to seek harmony with the cosmos and what one might very cautiously call the will of heaven, appropriately responding to its mandate. If this isn't quite a religious attitude, it is at least a reverential one, full of awe and respect for the unpredictable workings of a natural world that lies beyond our control and beyond our ken. As the Zhongyong puts it, the way of heaven and earth can be captured in one phrase. Since events are never duplicated, their production is unfathomable. Producing a podcast on the history of philosophy can sometimes feel pretty unfathomable too, but fortunately we can call on some pretty formidable assistance. Not from heaven, though that certainly wouldn't hurt, but from the experts who regularly join us to share their insights on the topics we've been covering. Having seen how the Confucians thought that political life should be structured, and how political rule is grounded in the application of ritual, virtue, and even music, we're now in a good position to think about how their political theory stacks up against more modern conceptions. For this purpose, we'll be joined by Sor Hun Tan, who has argued that there is a surprisingly good fit between Confucianism and democracy. So elect to join us next time for that, here on the History of Philosophy in China.